Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's panel event on food and racial justice. My name is Kelly Henderson, and I'm the K-12 Education Coordinator for Chatham University's Sustainable Eden Hall campus in Gibsonia, Pennsylvania. Tonight, I personally am calling in from Onondaga, otherwise known as Pittsburgh, which has been caretaken as the traditional territory by many indigenous nations, including the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Shawnee Nation, the Lenape Nation, and the Osage Nation. Decolonizing land, systems, hearts, and minds takes intentionality from every single one of us in every moment of every day. It takes action and not just continuous discussion, reading, or study groups. To us at Chatham's Eden Hall K-12 programs, this means prioritizing program scholarship funding and dedicated pipeline programs as a means for increasing representation of Black, Indigenous, and students of color in higher education programs and careers in sustainability. Ultimately, we believe that those who are most impacted by environmental issues like pollution and climate change should hold the most power and decision-making in addressing those issues. I'm going to share my screen for some quick visuals as part of our introduction. So that's what tonight's event is about. This event is part of a social justice and sustainability series, which is running from October to April. Each month is focused on the connections between different environmental issues and forms of social identity-based oppression. Next month, we'll be focusing on pollution, gender, and sexuality justice with similar panel events, discussion groups, and resource sharing. We think it's important that we start by explaining what we mean when we say social justice and sustainability. Social justice, as described by one of my favorite books, Readings for Diversity and Social Justice, requires the recognition of social group differences, including race, gender, ability, class, age, religion, citizenship status, and the way those differences are used to justify historic and ongoing inequality. And although we're digging deeper into racial justice this month and tonight, it's important to explain that social justice is intersectional, meaning that while we're talking about racial justice, we must also think about ways layering different gender, sexual orientation, citizenship, nationality, ability, age, class, or religious identities on top of race impacts an individual and social groups' lived experiences. For example, there are Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Asian, and other members of the racial global majority that are also women, differently abled, trans, etc., meaning many people are dealing with intersecting forms of oppression and systemic barriers. That brings me to our favorite way to explain sustainability. These are the 7 Sustainable Development Goals from the United Nations. As you can see, they define goals that seem to come from more of an environmental lens, like Goal 7, Affordable and Clean Energy, or Goal 13, Climate Action. But other goals are clearly focused on social issues, like goal number 1, no poverty, or goal 10, reduced inequalities. We think the most important thing to recognize is that all of these goals are connected to each other. We can't try to solve just one without potentially making other goals worse. This is called systems thinking. So in the end, all of the focus, environmental and social issues from each month of this social justice and sustainability series are connected. So we have to view everything that we're trying to address in our communities as interconnected in this way in order to make lasting progress. And for some of the young folks that are calling in tonight, I encourage you, especially as you listen to our panelists, to listen for some examples of systems thinking as you listen to our panel tonight. Tonight's event and this whole month focus on food and racial justice is brought to you in collaboration with the following co-host organizations, all based in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The Urban Kind Institute, Black Urban Gardeners and Farmers of Pittsburgh Co-op, Oasis Farm and Fishery, Grow Pittsburgh, the YWCA of Greater Pittsburgh, the Pittsburgh Food Policy Council. Our primary goal for the Social Justice and Sustainability series is to provide virtual learning resources, along with our virtual field trips that are launching soon, to young learners and educators to help build systems thinking skills. Even if you don't consider yourself a young learner or an educator, no matter who you are, you're welcome to learn with us during this event series. We also want to encourage everyone that's on the call tonight to also turn up for the youth panel on food and racial justice, which is the same time a week from tonight, featuring amazing young food and racial justice organizers, protesters, and poets from Pittsburgh Kappa, Westinghouse High School, City Charter High School, Winchester Thurston, North Allegheny High School, and South Fayette High School. We encourage you to learn more about all of tonight's co-host organizations and upcoming events in the Social Justice and Sustainability series using the resources that I'll post in the chat box momentarily, or that you'll see below the video recording if you're watching the recording. And now, without further ado, introducing tonight's panel moderator, welcome Tacumba Turner from Oasis Farm and Fishery. Thanks for joining us and introducing our panelists tonight, Tacumba.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here and excited for the conversation. Before we get into that, I would like to provide a brief synopsis of the food systems we continue to explore different facets. The food system is a term that encompasses the way food is produced, processed, distributed, consumed, and disposed of, and has direct impacts on the lives of both Americans and Canadians. Food systems are interconnected, as Kelly mentioned, and are integral parts of our well-being, of our communities, public health, and environmental sustainability, and the strength of the economy. So now I'd like to take the opportunity to kind of introduce each of the incredible Black and Indigenous women we have one by one. So Leticia, if you can please introduce yourself and tell the people a bit about who you are and what you do.
Thank you so much for having me. My name, again, is Leticia. I also go by Ama. I'm the director at the Black Creek Community Farm and also the chair of SeedChange, which is an international organization formerly known as YWCA Canada. And I sit on the Toronto Food Policy Council here in Toronto, and also a member of Jane Finch Action Against Poverty. So I'm looking forward to this conversation and sharing a bit more about the work that I'm doing in Toronto, Canada. Thanks.
Thank you, Leticia, for that. And next, we'll have Barbara introduce herself.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you. Thank you so much. Also, certainly honored to be here. I am probably one of the few people on the panel who is not coming from a food space. I work at YWCA Greater Pittsburgh. I'm the director of the Center for Race and Gender Equity, and my focus and my expertise is as a racial justice trainer, educator. So I come into this space to really explore with my co-panelists the intersection of race and food, and really begin to think about, again, as Kelly mentioned in the beginning, the intersections that we are certainly seeing in our communities and how that plays out in the food system. I have been at YWCA Greater Pittsburgh for 2 years. Prior to that, I was in the higher education system as a diversity and inclusion professional. And I sit on the board, 2 boards here in Pittsburgh, the Arise board, which works with immigrant youth, and Hill Dance Academy Theater, which is a dance company focused on keeping Black dance in children's lives, both through the culture, art, and history of our people. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Next, we'll have NaTisha. If you please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm NaTisha Washington, and I'm the environmental justice organizer at One Pennsylvania here in Pittsburgh. I am an urban gardener, a youth educator, and an overall environmental activist that's focused on not just Pittsburgh, but the whole Pennsylvania state. And I'm also glad to be here.
Excellent. And last but not least, Pomaj, would you mind introducing yourself to the people?
Greetings, everyone. In Lakesh Alakain, and in the words of my ancestors, which means the light in me honors the light in you. I'm happy to be here. I'm a shaman for the Iroquois Confederacy of Aborigine American people, an indigenous people that work with food sovereignty. I also am the program director for the Black Urban Gardeners and Farmers Cooperative, which my sister Raquibe is the founder and executive director of. I also am the co-chair for the Pittsburgh Food Policy Council, which is a part of the Pittsburgh Urban Agricultural Working Group, which is a part of the Pittsburgh Food Policy Council. And I'm a member of the Three Rivers Agricultural Land Initiative, which is a land protection cooperative that helps to secure green spaces in urban environments so that they are not later developed upon. Also work in food justice as well as food policy, and which is really important. And I'm glad to be here. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for that. And almost forgot to introduce myself. I'm the program manager of the Oasis Farm and Fishery. I oversee farming and education initiatives. I also involved with the Pittsburgh Food Policy Council and helping advocate for policies that improve urban farmers' access to capital, be able to provide nutrient-rich produce. So with that, I would like to go into the first question. Thank you all for introducing yourselves. And for the audience, please be sure to take notes so as we move to the Q&A. Things come to you. So with the first question, in your opinion, what is one of the key events or policies that have had a significant impact in influencing our current food system as we find it today, with many of the inequities we're confronted with? And anyone can take this first.
Well, I'd like to start by talking about policy and affecting policy or policy change at the government level. The federal government level has been something that we've worked towards, and we've made some great strides helping Pennsylvania to create the very first Pennsylvania Farm Food Bill, which was significant in a lot of ways. Still needs some work. It still has some quirks to work through, although it was a great step and is a great step in the right direction. And working with the Farm Bill is really essential because that's where all of the funding that's going to trickle down to the smaller urban farms comes from. So we need to have our voice there. And when our voice is there and it's heard and we affect change in that, that's a very important thing.
Great point. Well taken. With NaTisha, would you mind going next?
Yeah, so one of the things that I've had an issue with as far as policy is mostly when it comes to land access. There's not a really good system for us here when it comes to acquiring land, especially when we want to grow on land. They have, tried to do land trust, and that system hasn't been going well in many states, unfortunately. It's a good concept, but it just isn't working out. And our representatives on the council are not really, helping push any of that forward when they can be the ones that okay us to have these access to lands, which should be a thing if we're working on them for multiple years, which we have been. But it's been a struggle just to try to get them to go through that treasure sale that they have set up just to get the land that we need to grow on. And not only with growing, like access to land for open green spaces, for stormwater projects, or any other green related projects that we try to do, there's always the barrier of not having access to that land because we're limited on what we can put on that land if we're not owners of it. And then not being owners of it is also a very fearful thing because it feels like at any moment it can be taken away from us. So that's becoming a big issue with people who are trying to do all these green projects around the area. And I think that's the most prominent policy that's been an issue for me in my work for most of the stuff I've done.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for sharing. Barbara, would you mind going next?
Sure. As I mentioned earlier, I am not coming into the space with a background in food, but I can definitely speak to some of the anecdotal things that I'm aware of. And it was interesting because after our last conversation together as a panel, just talking about how we wanted this conversation to go, I remembered vividly, was not born in Pittsburgh and didn't go to school here. So I don't have a connection with people who go to school here, but I do remember having a conversation once where they were talking about the inner city grocery stores and how the produce goes to the suburban supermarkets. And then the inner city supermarkets get like the end and the worst of the product. And I remember, again, not being from Pittsburgh, thinking, what a strange thing. Like that was the first time I had ever heard something like that. And then another anecdotal story that I was talking to Kelly about, which was really interesting from a racial perspective. So I live in a community that is predominantly Black. And so when I go to my local grocery store, which it's a grocery store chain, so it's the same store all over the place, right? So when I go to my grocery store, there's a police officer there. And I have never thought twice about why, right? Because it's just always been there. And so I was having a conversation with my colleague who is white, and she works on racial justice issues with me. And we were having a conversation, and I was telling her about a story that I was talking to the police officer about, and she had this weird look on her face. And so finally she said, I just have to ask you, like, why is there a police officer in your store? And I looked at her perplexed, thinking, well, you have the same store in your neighborhood. Don't you have a police officer there? And she said, no. And so, we had a good conversation then about the racial, ramifications of even a grocery store where you go and shop for your food, and how, a person of color is so used to there being a police officer there that it would have never occurred to me that you could have a grocery store that doesn't have one. And she, on the other hand, was, as a white person, was thinking the same thing. Like, it would never occur to her that there would be a police officer in a grocery store. So I think that, the systemic, and that was mentioned earlier, that there are, from my perspective, that there are so many systemic issues that have been the foundation of our country's beginnings, that even when slavery ended, those systems changed names and very much stayed a part of our world, of our continent. And so we see them show up in different ways. And so guarding food and guarding a supermarket, becomes one of those systems that, becomes part of the everyday living that we have. So those would be two examples that I think of. And then I think it's important for me to also share, when I do educational workshops on racial justice, I define race in the definition that Audre Lorde gave, which is the assumed superiority of one group over another based on skin color and the right to oppress, dominate, exclude, abuse, hate, and, as we are noticing a lot in our country now, to kill. And that's Audre Lorde's definition of racism. And so again, if we think about the food systems and how each of those adjectives definitely plays a role in how food is available and accessible and given to us as Brown and Black people in this country. Thank you.
Thank you for the eloquent answer. And lastly, Leticia, if you could.
Thank you. I was looking at this question from a historical perspective, in terms of looking at colonization and also looking at slavery and the impact of that on our current food system. One example I can give is the Indian Act, and how Indigenous people were basically, there was an attempt, right, to eradicate their culture, their social studies, their economics, right, from them, and the impact that it had overall on their food system. And I think when we think about that, most of the time we think about it in a North American context, but think about it also in the African context, because what happened here was the exact same thing that also happened on the continent. So there were, of course, the removal of people from their homes and continents and bringing them over to North America to work on plantations, but also there were plantations within those African countries as well. I was doing a bit of work and I found out that peanuts was a really big thing also in Senegal back then. And people's ways and their food systems were all removed. And then cash crops were introduced. And then, you know, the 5 white gifts that the white people brought was also introduced to people. So I always use this analogy of this African clay pot that we have, that my grandmother still used to prepare her meals. It always, when you prepare meals, like Ghanaian meals, I'm Ghanaian, when you prepare Ghanaian meals using that clay pot, your food is healthy, it's very different. But when you use something like the frying pan, which my people were introduced to, now you're frying everything. It changes the way that Ghanaian food is and Ghanaian cuisine is experienced, and it has a huge impact in terms of our people, our mental and physical health as well. So whenever I think back to this particular question, I think back to historical moments that had a huge impact in terms of food system, looking at the Indian Act, looking at colonization globally, looking at slavery and the impact that it had on us as a people, and even the ongoing issues that Indigenous people in Canada face right now, where you know, they're fighting very, very hard to be able to keep their territories and to be able to keep their lands and to be able to have safe drinking water. Like some of the things that we may deem as very simple, to have a safe drinking water, and also to be able to fish and hunt within your own land is a huge issue. I also want to bring back like one other historical moment. I believe it was Similac and Nestle that were testing literally their foods on children on the continent and in Asia. And a lot of Black mothers were told that breastfeeding was not good for their babies and that they needed to use Similac to feed their babies. And that had a huge impact in terms of, you know, our food system and in terms of being able to even nurture our children and our babies. And now, you know, this concept and even this idea with some of our mothers and grandmothers of like, breastfeeding is good. Sometimes it's a very difficult conversation to have because they're used to Similac, because that's what they were sold to. You needed, if you want Similac, you have to get your baby vaccinated. Vaccination was also used in conjunction with that. And then you get Similac. And then you get what we call Tom Brown, which was literally the US dumping of soya beans on the African continent because they had so much of it from the war that they convinced parents and mothers to really forget about their own cultural traditions and foods for their babies and to use that food, soya beans food, to feed them as well. So I think these are some of the historical moments that it's good to kind of delve into a little bit and how it has an impact on our overall health and how it has an impact also within the current food system as well. So I'll leave it that for now. Thanks.
Thank you.
May I add on to what she said, because there's some really great points and I'll take a very short while to do it.
Please, go ahead.
So I'm glad she brought up the Indian Removal Act. As an Aborigine American Indian myself, also the land grant colleges that came right after that, and the Land Act, the Land Grant Acts, those played a very, very significant role in Aborigine and Black people at that time who owned a lot of land throughout the South. And what that did was it transferred the wealth and it transferred the educational aspect of growing food. So we were demonized for growing it, and we were ostracized out of these land grant colleges that actually undergirded the Europeans when they were given millions of acres of land in the Midwest, we were being displaced from our lands. And during that time, they were also given educational tools to help them to learn how to grow the food, because we traditionally were the growers of the food. So that played a role in even today how we look at growing food, and how there's this stigma associated with Aborigine, American Indian, and Black people growing food. We have to re-establish our history of the fact that this is something that we did prior to slavery. We did this to sustain ourselves, and we were really good agriculturalists and permaculturalists. So she makes a really great point in that. That was the beginning of that whole process of removing us from the land. And then when our brothers and sisters were brought here, and then they were forced to grow food, we were actually being moved off of our lands and not being allowed to grow our food. So it is a systemic problem, and we share this connection that this is something that is very, very necessary for us to delve deeper into, because we have these connections with the same trauma related to agriculture and growing and land control and land access. So thank you so much for the sister for bringing that up. I just wanted to add that to that.
Am I able to add something as well?
Sure.
It's going to be really, really quick.
No problem. No problem. That's what we're here for.
I just wanted to make the point that, yeah, we do have all these things that historically have, pushed us away from growing our foods that we need to nurture ourselves. But there are also so many current laws that are being passed that are just being reworded and also doing the same thing to us, because now that we've all kind of like mobilized with each other and start to fight against these issues, they're now like, oh, they're starting to figure things out. Let's put in these new laws. And then they kind of like now frame this urban farming around how they want it in their standards with their communities. Mm-hmm. And then they tell us that our communities are not of standard to have the things that they now have in their communities. Unfortunately, I was just in a very frustrating meeting that City Council was having, where they were talking about using a model from Deb Gross's council, which is all the white fufu areas that she has, because they had just started their, remember, Tacumba, I think you know about this meeting with the council that we were talking about. Raquib was there too, yes, where they were trying to grow food. And so they did that. And then they're like, oh, Deb Gross did all this great stuff with all this money. And then I'm like, well, what about all the gardens and farms that we have in East Pittsburgh? Why are they not being modeled after? Why aren't they being acknowledged? Why aren't you talking to them about how they did what they needed to do to grow food in their communities? And you're going to try to put budget money in like the South Side and into these neighborhoods that don't even need them. And you're not going to put them into the areas that have been working really hard and do need them. And I was just like so frustrated. And now they're passing bills on that. And I'm like, oh, so y'all are going to just keep adding and adding so it fits y'all standards and not ours. And it was just, it's a very frustrating thing to think that they're still like trying to put these barriers for us to not be able to sustain ourselves or help self-reliant communities.
Thank you for adding that part. And if I could briefly lament before we move on to the next part of our conversation, seems everyone has kind of spoke to different facets of like the macro scale, and hopefully now we can kind of transition into some of the work you are individually doing to advance food equity. And I would like to continue this, bookmark this for the end, where we can have a broader conversation. We allow some questions to come in, and the panelists can ask questions to each other. So please take notes of your thoughts. And with that, we have a video ready that we wanted to show. So Kelly, if you're ready, and Leticia, we'll start with you with this video once it's done playing.
Challenges that the Jane and Finch community faces multiple systemic barriers: housing, education, employment, and food security is some of the challenges that this community face. In 2009, a heart and stroke study did find that the community pays about 7% more for fresh produce in comparison to other neighborhoods across the city. In a high immigrant community, the having culturally appropriate food is very important. So, of course, the Jane Finch Action Against Poverty study did find that indeed the community is paying astronomically high rates for fresh produce in comparison to other neighborhoods, and that transportation is also one key piece in terms of people's access to food. With some of the work from the Toronto Food Policy Council, really looking at developing an urban agriculture center within the city. They work with the TRCA and with other organizations like Food Share Toronto to create the Black Creek Community Farm.
Is healing our communities. Fruits and roots is healing our communities. Fruits and roots is healing our communities. Fruits and roots is healing our communities.
So some of the sage and things in there, you can, touch them and smell them. And then, like, if you're even just sitting here, just feeling some of these plants, like this feels rough, but then feel this one. Come and feel this.
The farm is situated in the heart of Jane and Finch, is 8 acres altogether, and it sits in the watershed of the city.
That's why one looks like way bigger than the other.
We have trail systems, we have community gardens, so community members can get access to a plot of land to grow their own vegetables. We have pollinator gardens, and we also have a food forest.
Raspberry? Yeah, so you just want to pull it and then not the whole thing like that. Like just the berry itself, you hold like here. See? And then it comes off like that. You're welcome.
We are a farm park, and what that means is that you can come on site, go for a walk in our trails, enjoy the beautiful site, have a picnic, and that's all free. And we felt it was very important in terms of looking at the lack of tree canopy within the Jane and Finch community, that this land be made accessible to that. One of the ways that we are trying to look at the food insecurity in the community is by producing organic vegetables and selling it at a sliding scale and affordable rate so that low-income families are able to also get fresh produce from us. And we also have a CSA, which is community supported agriculture, where you can pay in advance and get fresh produce from us.
All of this is grown here, certified organic. We're the farmers. Yeah. And then
Amazing.
Thank you. So, I saw a question. I feel like it's a nice segue. Leticia, you can speak a bit about, just a little bit more about the work you're doing, and also, where you're doing the work. I don't know if everyone's aware.
Yeah.
Where you're operating out of.
Yeah, so the video you saw is a quick 10-minute video, a snapshot of the Black Creek Community Farm based in Toronto in the Jane and Finch community, as mentioned. So the Jane and Finch community is a high immigrant Black people of color neighborhood, is a low income neighborhood. And I remember, I think Barbara, you mentioned about the police within the grocery stores. So we have police, we have security, we have undercover cops in our grocery stores. The food, the vegetables we have in the stores are not as fresh as like if you were to go to Whole Foods, which is like just 20 minutes away from where we live. And you can get an abundance of fresh vegetables and deli sessions and things like that. So it's literally what Karen Washington's term, food apartheid. Literally, we live in a food apartheid in Canada, and especially in a country that is supposedly one of the richest countries in the world. So part of the work we do is really we have this eight acres of land in the city of Toronto, which is also unbelievable, especially when I even tell people in Toronto that there's this land, they don't believe it, that we have this vast land right within the city. Is situated in our community, which is deemed as the poorest neighborhood in the whole city of Toronto. And a lot of the work that we do is really looking at how we can engage community members in growing food, but also we do outdoor environmental education as well for children, for high school kids. So we see about 2,500 kids a year that comes through some of our programs, because education is really, really important and core to the work that we do. And it is difficult, but part of what we also try to do is also sell our vegetables at a low rate so that folks in our community can buy it, but we also hike up the price a little bit so that folks that are higher income will be able to afford and kind of help us out to level the playing field a little bit. Since COVID hit and our community, again, I'm sure you are pretty much aware, our community is also hit disproportionately by COVID. We've started an emergency food program where we serve over 3,000 households. And we have delivered over 12,000 emergency boxes actually to families to date. And our numbers keep growing. So we're always looking for different ways that we can support families with vegetables that we grow, but also partner with Food Share Toronto to purchase food from the terminal and then box that food and then have the food delivered to families directly. So that's a bit of the work that we do. We have a resident group called the Black Creek Food Justice Network, who takes on some of the issues around the policing in the grocery stores. And even a ridiculous policy that came is that you couldn't take your shopping carts or strollers or things like that into the grocery store. And community members mobilized very quickly, made a lot of noise online on Twitter, and had the policy removed. So basically, it turned out it was an old policy that's never really implemented, but since that particular store wanted to implement it and it raised awareness among community members, and people really pushed to really make sure that that policy is removed, and that seniors, like how are seniors supposed to take their groceries home if they can't bring their buggies inside? So it's some of those issues that we try to tackle at the farm. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Barbara, would you mind speaking a bit more about, some of the initiatives you've overseen and, how those things connect to community well-being and public health, being that you're not directly involved with food, but certainly doing work interconnected?
Right. So I guess I would just say that much of the education that I do around racial justice speaks to the issue of the intersection. So, people want to know why a person can't, afford to have, food. So if their socioeconomic status doesn't allow them to get healthy food, that impacts their health, right? And so puts them at greater risk for all the different health issues and disparities that are showing up related to COVID. And so there's this consistent layering of issues, one after the other that are definitely guided by race, that create the disparities around that. And so, last week we had a panel talking about breast cancer. And the thing that we talked about was how when you have healthcare in a system, there's the healthcare itself is not biased based on socioeconomic status. And they have studies that talk about this. And it also is not based on educational attainment. So a very smart Black woman could go into the hospital and still get treated in a poor way based on skin color alone. And so the studies have shown that the racial bias is the key indicator, not socioeconomic status and not educational attainment. So sometimes there's a perception that, oh, you're getting poor quality healthcare because you can't afford it, or because you're not asking the right questions. And the research indicates that that is definitely not the case. But then the intersection also moves on to housing, it moves on to access, it moves on to where you live. If you live in a community where there's lots of noise, if there's violence, if there's poor air quality, again, you're impacted racially around your ability to stay healthy, and then to start to deal with all the, the negative impact of the food system and the issues around healthcare. So it's just a layering. And, we use the word intersectionality, but I think the layering helps people to see that it's not just one thing. And so if you fix one thing, there's still a system that's created all the other layers. And so, to give me the ability to have food, if I don't have access to it and I can't get there, then it doesn't help. Leticia talked about, elders. If they need to have a cart to go into the grocery store to get their food, and you take away the cart, then they can't get their food. And the other thing that I have witnessed, a friend of mine has been doing a lot of the food drives here in Pittsburgh, and you have to have a car. You have to have a car to drive up and get your box put in your trunk. Well, if you don't have a car, how do you get that? And so she really worked towards systems change to create those drives in the city, so that people who are in a cart, or even with their, carrying their baby and they have a stroller, that they can put a box in something and take the food home. So those are some of the things that, we try to talk about when we talk about racial justice, is the layers of racial injustice that compound the issue at greater levels than not.
Yeah, certainly compounding and synergistic. NaTisha, would you mind speaking to some of the work that you do?
Yeah. So most of my work is around environmental justice. I do focus a lot also on health and education. And Barbara, just to speak quickly, what you were talking about, when we were doing the farmers market in the organization I was working for, Operation Better Block, we started doing the food deliveries, and just seeing like how many seniors really needed that. Like, they had these food vouchers that their doctors gave them, or that they had, and they didn't know what to do with them, and they were going to expire in November, and they were like, oh, I could use this for farmers market food. And I was like, yes, you can. And they were just like pulling out stacks of vouchers and being like, please take these. I love collard greens. I love zucchini. I want all of that stuff. And if we didn't have that program to deliver that food to them, they would have never gotten it, because these are a whole bunch of people that aren't able to walk. A lot of them aren't able to leave their houses, not just because of physical disabilities, but because of COVID. And it was like, the people that gave them the food vouchers, it was like they just didn't think about that at all. And it was a very unfortunate situation. But a lot of the things that I've done focuses around, like, not only with food access, but how we're talking about with all the other aspects, like even air quality with pollution of transportation and people driving in and out of our communities and not really staying there, and having all these trucking companies and bus companies in our community that are contributing to all these childhood asthma, adult asthma cases that we have within our communities, has been a big issue that we've been fighting for. Stormwater flooding, that's been flooding our streets and flooding people's basements, which leads to mold, which leads to asthma issues. Like, it's a very connected system. And even things like us in Homewood not having a lot of trees, but Point Breeze, which is right on the other side, having lots of trees that can shield them from this air pollution issue, is like so unfair. And trying to change these policies and trying to push people to put more investment into these communities that need it more, instead of making another big park or another addition to Westinghouse Park, even though we like Westinghouse Park and we want to use Westinghouse Park. There's just so many more issues that need to be addressed before we start trying to do cosmetic environmental things to our other neighboring communities and not our own communities. Like, we don't have a lot of green open spaces where kids can come in. I just had to fight with the city because they had installed all this equipment at Baxter Park and didn't tell anybody. And then we had to fuss at the city for them to even do a ribbon cutting, which they were doing with other parks, just so kids can know that they have equipment that they can go outside and play in. And it was just like, why is it when it comes to our communities that y'all obviously forget, like, oh, we didn't get to engage in nobody and we didn't know who to call, yet they call us when they want us to talk to our people to get on board with their projects. And so I spend a lot of time just like fussing at people most of the time. And then education, especially with our youth, and trying to get them to understand that these impact them as well. These aren't just adult issues, or these aren't just things that you see on TV or see in other states that are happening. It's happening to their communities as well, and getting them to see why that is important to their own health and why that's important to their family and even their future that's coming up, because a lot of the stuff that we're doing isn't going to last our lifetime, unfortunately. Like if we plant 1,000 trees right now, it's not really going to affect us. It's going to affect our future generation. So kind of making people understand that we need to think about everybody and not just the few. I know there are a lot of times that because we are in the positions that we're in, that people want to focus on us and focus on the stuff that we do. But one of the things that I try to focus on is being like, hey, there's like 10 other people that do this too. And there are 10 other people that you need to talk to if you really want to put money into these communities. Because a lot of times what I've seen is they try to isolate us and they'll say, oh, I'll work with that person and then I'll do work with them. And then they'll just, give information to the other people after we're finished working on it. And I'm like, no, everybody needs to be on board with this. Like all of our Black communities have the same issues and we all need to be in these rooms and getting this money, because there is money there and they act a lot of times like there's not. So I just try to focus on trying to make sure that everybody eats and all these issues are being addressed and that everybody gets a seat at the table. Because one of the things when I first started was I was just tired of being the only Black person at some of these tables. And I'm tired of seeing tables where there's no Black people. And then they write these racial disparity like reports on how things are affecting us when they have nobody on their board that is Black. So that's most of what I do is just yell at people all day.
We need you to yell at people.
Yeah, pretty much.
Oh, man, if you wouldn't mind.
Just adding on to what Leticia said, she said everything she said was poignant and very powerful, and her work that she's doing is very appreciated. If nobody is telling you that, I will tell you that it's very appreciated. And working with the Black Urban Gardeners and Farmers Cooperative, we also found that the elders were kind of being left out when it came to food boxes. We gave away hundreds of food boxes this summer. We have a farmers market every Saturday that we partnered with. You already know. And so that was really powerful, and it got a lot of people involved and out in the community to see that, we can do this thing for ourselves. More importantly, though, what I found being a part of the food access and even a part of the Homewood comprehensive plan is that, these people come in and they don't look like us, and they kind of want to dictate to us based on studies that they've done across the country. We're a unique community, and all communities are very unique and have its own set of issues when it comes to the environment and access to food, when it comes to food sustainability and sovereignty. All of these things are hand in hand. They go hand in hand with each other. We can't really look at one without looking at the other. And as she mentioned, stormwater management and that kind of thing, that also affects our ability to grow food in our communities too as well. And when we talk about environmental issues, we have to mention that Pittsburgh was a still community. It was a still city. And so a lot of our soil is contaminated. Even if we're having access to these places to grow food, we need to deal with that. So, as a member of Bugs and also as a member of the Iroquois Confederacy, we've been meeting with the city and attempting to, like everybody else, hold them accountable. But we always tell them, the basis of all of these things that we're talking about is colonization. And if we kind of not don't include that in the conversation, that colonization destroys everything, indigenous, everything, that is meant that the people need to survive on, and it focuses on capitalism. So if we're going to talk about all of these issues, we have to talk about capitalism. And the bottom line is, what is the city's goal? The city's goal is to make money for the city. It's really not to focus on what the issues are in the community. So we have to, kind of turn that conversation into, this capitalist conversation, as well as this colonization conversation, and show the disparities from that perspective too, as well, because then it holds them accountable in a different way. I just wanted to add that, because I know all the work we do is great, and I don't like to sugarfoot things and sugarcoat things. And when we speak to them, how you speak truth to power, you got to speak it in the language that they know that they come from, and they come from the colonization perspective, and they come from the capitalistic perspective. So we come from the sustainability perspective, keeping our lands clean and pure, keeping our water clean and pure, keeping our air quality clean and pure. And they focus on things that's going to make the city money. And if it's going to poison our water, if it's going to destroy our air quality, if it's going to ruin our soil, those are the methods that we use when we address them. And it is chiseling away at an iceberg, although it's necessary. It's very necessary. I just wanted to add to NaTisha, but everything she said is what is the work that we do collectively, and it becomes overwhelming. And we do community outreach, having the community understand and overstand and even understand how important this work is for 7 generations down the road, so that they can see it's difficult when people are trying to figure out how they're going to eat day to day and what they're going to put on their tables, and if they can make their bills, so that's a quagmire that we all work in.
Go.
Sorry, I know that time is going, but somebody had a question that I wanted to respond to, if that's okay.
Yeah, that actually is a perfect segue. So. Oh,
okay. So one piece around it. Should I read the question now? Because maybe not everybody has. So the question is: I was recently reading "Who Really Feeds the World" by Dr. Vandana Shiva, which discusses how local agriculture and food practices are most superior for local ecology and cultures. Through this, she implies that biotechnology allows the so-called West to justify compelling other countries out of their traditional practices. I was wondering whether the panelists had any commentary on this in terms of the indigenous practices and Ghanaian practices that were mentioned. So in terms of this question, so I find that what is happening is, in terms of the West, a lot of farms and farmers are moving into ecological way of farming. So a lot of corporations are putting a lot of their attention in Asia and Africa. So how they're packaging it for farmers. So if you're a farmer and you want support for your farm, they're telling you that you need to sign on to receive this chemical fertilizers, as an example, and in order to be able to access resources. And how you're doing it is really pinning it as this is the way to get more yield for your farm. There isn't a lot of, so a lot of the chemicals you're getting is in English, and some of them, English is not their first language. They don't know how to read it. So you have issues where some farmers are actually using more chemicals than they need to, and it's going then in the waterways. And then you see literally children fetching water to go home and to go feed. And when there's an oil spill on water and you see that rainbow color on the water, you literally see the chemicals on the water like that. And then you see families fetching that water to go and feed themselves. And they're literally setting up factories, big chemical factories in these countries. When a lot of farmers want to farm the way that their ancestors farmed, that's the way that they know. And that's the way that they know is healthy, but they're also getting a lot of pushback, right? And being pushed out of their farming practices. So it's also pitched to a lot of governments as like, you have a hunger issue or you have a food security issue. This is the way to improve, right? it's pinned as like, if you buy this huge machinery, it means that your farm will be more successful. And even to the point that some of these organizations are funding food security, so-called food security initiatives on the continent, to also get them to write articles that states that, oh, these people that are telling you not to use the chemicals and not to use the big machinery, they don't want you to get out of the old way of doing things. They want you to be stuck and to not be financially viable. So it's pinned as like, this is the new modern way, less labor intensive way of doing things. There's little care for the environment. So a lot of it is like cutting down a lot of trees, right? And growing soya beans, dominantly cash crops, pineapple, cashew, palm oil, now mango, whereby hundreds of years old of baobab trees are being cut down to grow mango so that that mango can be shipped to another country. And then the worst part is, then you're then shipping in food from the other country into it. So like, there are some Brazilian companies that operate and literally have bought up a river in Ghana to farm, and the food that they grow leaves the country to Brazil. And then guess what? Ghana buys Brazilian chicken from Brazil to ship into the country. And they're selling it at a cheaper price. And of course, these chickens have so much hormones and different things. They come big and fat. They're not like the African chickens that you find that are big, you know, skinny. So when you as a farmer are trying to sell this at the market, your own local food to people, they don't want to buy it because it's a bit more pricey. They rather buy the cheap stuff that is coming in, whether it is healthy or not. And the market in Ghana is being saturated a lot with a lot of Chinese products, right? And it's like the recolonization, I don't know what the correct term is, of the China as a state on the continent, and the way, and illegal mining, right? And the way it's destroying waterways, it's destroying the environment. A village that I'm from that used to have springs and a lot of food is facing drought. Actually, at this particular time, come November, December, January, February, they face drought. And the rivers stop flowing. There's no water. The land is dry. If you're going into the village, you have to buy food from outside. You have to get all your produce from outside before you go in. So these are like, and the problem is when they're pitching these corporations, and mind you, these are corporations from here that are going over there. They're pitching it under food security. And I think that's the problem. That's a huge problem, especially, I'm gonna say the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. People see it as like, they're doing good work. They're literally destroying thousands of years of African ancestral agricultural system in favor of chemicals and in favor of destroying that environment so that the continent becomes dependent on these corporations always for food. So it's not building food sovereignty, and it's not food security by any means of the word. It's just world domination and imperialism, right?
Exactly. And to add to that, when we talk about, when I mentioned about policy, I should have even gone further than that. Working in policy at the international level is what's going to turn the corner for these conversations. We're talking locally, and I know that it's important for us to talk about our individual areas where we're working at in our urban environments and even some of the rural environments that are affected too. This is an international problem. So when we frame it from an international perspective and how this is world domination of food systems, then it changes the conversation. So I know the work we do is really important, and I know that our voices would serve better collectively at the international level. So when we start to motivate ourselves and maybe mobilize a little bit better where we can speak on an international level, then we can call these people out, because these world leaders are the ones that are responsible. And again, it goes back to colonization and capitalism. Of course, they're going to frame it in the conversation. They catch the phrase words that we use. They learn what those words are, food apartheid, and then they use those very words and that language against us. So we have the power to refrain them from doing that when we're speaking to these higher ups. I don't know what to call them. I know they're international world leaders and world bankers. They're also responsible for this because they're the ones who are funding a lot of this and getting a lot of the benefits, you know, from the reciprocal benefits. So I don't want to get myself all flustered, but this conversation, it touches heart, it touches home, because we as the Aborigine, the indigenous peoples of the world are the ones that are always most affected when it comes to these policies, when it comes to these ill-conceived and these depredations that these nation states and these heads of nations kind of sit behind, and they put those people in front. But they're the ones behind the scenes making the decisions. Like, these are world leaders making these decisions about our global world food system. So you're absolutely right, sister. And you know, my heart goes out to the people that are affected by this all over the world. So I yield.
And, you know, I want to thank all of our panelists for such a rich conversation. I hope that everyone was able to take some of the wisdom that was dispensed here, and that you'll follow up what each of the panelists, if you have further questions or like to support the work or learn more about how you can be involved. So much was said. You know, I think I'll just leave it at that. Thank the audience for joining in, and yeah.
Thank you, everyone.
Yes, thank you, everyone.
Thank you all so much. And I look forward to connecting more, because I think as Black people, how we connect globally and in doing and fight on all different fronts is really important. So I look forward to connecting and working closer together.
I look forward to it too.
Definitely.
I always
Same.
learn a lot. And I appreciate all of you.
Yes,
Likewise.
definitely.
Same. I
Thank you
appreciate
so
all
much.
of your
You're
work.
amazing.
Hey,
Let's stay connected.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.